taste, but I just got a milk tea from a tea. It looks
a tea shop and
a tea.
Get out of here.
Yeah.
Take them everywhere to say, look, they're nice.
And I can tell you already, it is delicious. It is so delicious. So, come to London and you go near the Happy Days restaurant, which we're gonna eat there too here in a little bit. Stop at the Tea London Boba Milk Shop. You will not go wrong. So we just started the Jack the Ripper walking tour, and we have our tour guide John, and we're gonna cross some streets and we're gonna do some fun little trivia bits. So yay!
There was a time when the East End of London was not the kind of place you'd come to have a good time. Right? It wasn't a particularly nice place at all. To say it's had more downs than ups is putting it mildly. Right? The lowest the East End ever sank is, conveniently, part of our story, the late 19th century. All right? So everything I'm going to tell you this evening happened in the year 1888, right? Unless I say otherwise, but everything is 1888. When most people consider the East End of London to be perhaps one of the most notorious, overcrowded, dangerous slums in London. And this is really odd, because you've got to bear in mind, it's 1888, it's the time of Queen Victoria, the British Empire covering about a third of the globe. The City of London, which is right next to us here, that's Old Square Mile, which is the financial heart of London as it's always been. Back then, because it was the centre of empire, it was the wealthiest and most influential, powerful square mile on this planet back then. So it is. So I mean, just out of necessity, I skipped over the problems of the East End, which are actually part of this story. And homelessness was one of them. In the 1880s, we didn't have all the benefits and the help and the institutions for the homeless as we do today. So yeah, I mean, if you literally were out there on your own, or your family, and you were homeless, nowhere to go, you would be sleeping in dangerous alleyways or in parks in all weathers. It was all very dangerous and very unfortunate. There were things like workhouses that you could go into where you would be made to do mind-numbing, back-breaking work for the privilege of your food and shelter. A lot of those places were made deliberately unpleasant just to put people off who just didn't fancy going to work, things like that. However, for a little price, a little bit of money, if you had it, you, or even you and your family, could get a bed overnight in something called a common lodging house, something which, thank God, doesn't exist anymore. There were lots of them around back in those days. A common lodging house was also known as a doss house. And anyone from the United States? I think we have a few. Flop house, they were known as in the States. Okay, a building, house, whatever it was, owned by a greedy landlord. And apart from a communal kitchen, every room had as many beds as they could cram in. Right? And at the door, you would pay a deputy 4p. I think that's roughly about £5 today, for a single bed. All right, okay. In a communal room. You're sharing rooms with strangers, many of them who are a little bit dodgy, let's just say that. You might be sharing your room or even your bed with vermin as well, because they weren't particularly well maintained. Your bed was pretty much like a coffin, really, with a straw mattress in it that was very rarely clean, so goodness knows what was crawling around in there. And yeah, they weren't very nice places at all. There were men-only ones, there were women-only ones, and there were also doss houses where if you had 8p, you could hire a double bed. And yeah. Basically, they were unlicensed brothels, right? And the owners pretended nothing was going on. It was all very illegal. So that brought down the reputation of doss houses generally. But the East End of London had lots of doss houses. It's supply and demand, you know. Lots of homeless people, therefore lots of places to put them up. It also had not only probably the highest concentration of doss houses in London, but also the most dangerous area of doss houses in London, and that was that area there. Now this now goes under the name of the Flower and Dean Estate. Sounds rather nice. And today it is a nice place where children can play and sing and dance, right? But back in the day, that area was bad news, right? Now the name Flower and Dean comes from Flower and Dean Street, which used to exist there, probably the most notorious street of the lot. And there was Thrall Street, part of which still exists. There was George Street, all these little courts and alleyways. Apart from one little block, literally every property in that wicked area was a doss house of the worst character. I have it. All right then, so we started in the neighbourhood, the parish of Whitechapel. This is the area known as Spitalfields. This is the heart of Spitalfields, which was actually the first area to be gentrified, tidied up, made fun, right? In the late 80s, early 1990s. Back at the time of our story though, Spitalfields, they said, I've read this somewhere as well, if you went to all the narrowest streets and courts and alleyways of Spitalfields, you could satisfy yourself that you had seen the very worst that mankind could offer. So it was the area that had the worst crime, the worst poverty, etc. It's changed for the better, obviously. It's now that place where trendy people like me come and have fun, right? But hello everyone. Right, okay, so this is Hanbury Street. This is the scene of the second murder. I've already introduced poor Annie Chapman, the victim. There have been changes. Right then. Now, as I say earlier on, this is an important thing. The media had a lot to answer for this, right? And actually, you could argue that after the Hanbury Street horror, as it was known, this is where it became a worldwide phenomenon, right? Thanks to the media as it was back then, suddenly the world sat up and listened. Illiteracy was improving, right? There were more newspapers around in those days than there are today. There's something for every taste. Lots of different news agencies that distribute the news to the various organs of the media. And you've got technology for the first time, the telegraph, the wire that goes under the oceans, you know. So suddenly, after that, people around the world can hear about this. Okay? Out of all those news agencies, I'll just into that, some of them are still going. Reuters, all right, is still around. The Associated Press. Reuters had a main competitor in London. It was called the Central News Agency, right? And they are actually central to this next bit of the story, very important. On the 27th of September, okay, so 19 days after Annie Chapman's murder, the Central News Agency received a letter in the post addressed to the boss, Central News, London City, right? And here is that letter, okay? Now, it's not the real one. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? Imagine if we had the real one. The real one does survive. It was missing for many years, but it now sits in the heart. Right then, so yeah, the night of the double event, it became known. That's the third and the fourth murders within 45 minutes of each other. So the victims are Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes. The murder of Catherine Eddowes, actually the fourth in the series, demonstrate how these murders were getting progressively more unpleasant. Right? And also, after that fourth murder, there was a controversy attached to it, which was notorious at the time and was so controversial then that people are still arguing about it even today, even now. Right? And when I say now, I mean like now. There's people on social media arguing about it. That's modern ripperology for you. Don't go there. Anyway, all important stuff, right? But because where the locations are that relate to what happened that night, we're going to have to skip it for the minute. All right? They're down that way. We're on our way there. So what we're going to do is done the first and the second, we'll come back to third and fourth in the mo, but here, very importantly, we'll stop for a good reason. The fifth and final murder in the series, which took place on November the 9th, 1888, and it's arguably the most famous, romanticised and fictionalised of those victims. Mary Jane Kelly, right? Often known as Marie Jeanette Kelly, and there are reasons for that fame, if you like, that infamy. For a start, I mean, have you noticed the age group of the women so far? Their 40s, you'll notice it again later on. Now today we know that that's not old, right? Come on, help me out here, please. Right? 40s. But they'd had a tough life. Mary Jane Kelly was believed to be about 25 years old. So they said she still had her youth, her vivacity, you know. They described her as a handsome young lady. You know, it's got a young life cut tragically short all over this thing here. And there is a background story that she brought with her. Apparently she was born to a large family in the Republic of Ireland. But I think during the famines, the family moved to Wales, okay, during the famines. And at 16, she married a miner. Right? and by the age of 18 he died in an accident, so she'd been widowed by the age of 18, and basically she ended up in Cardiff working as a prostitute with one of her cousins, right? That's what she said. The rest of gets a little bit vague. There are claims that she spent some time living in France with a gentleman. She escaped that life apparently under a cloud. She was quite desperate to get away from it, and in hindsight some people have suggested that she may have been a victim of sex trafficking, and there was a lot of that about in the Victorian period. There's also rumours that she spent some time working in a brothel in the West End of London, a very high class one as well. I mean, be that as it may, in 135 years of some pretty serious research by some very talented researchers, no one's been able to prove that anything I've just told you is true. Right? So Mary Kelly is as mysterious as the man who ended her life. Right? What we do know is that by 1885 she'd found her way to the East End of London. She was living in Poplar, near the London docks, Breezes Hill, working out of a very low-class brothel in that neighbourhood. This actually used to be a door. That means that was a women's entrance. If you go around the side, there's actually another window, and it says men. This was built in 1860, right? And it was the Providence Row night shelter for homeless men and women. It was run by nuns from the Convent of Mercy, right? Up until, I do believe, about 1999. Okay, so up until then, that was actually a door. There is actually a figure of the Virgin Mary still up on the main entrance there. Now, I will mention this. In 1972, around about that time, researchers from the BBC, bless them, interviewed a very elderly nun who was working there. And she'd been working there since pretty much the First World War. And she said when she started working there, she was talking to some other elderly nuns who'd been there obviously long before that, who were quite adamant that Mary Jane Kelly once resided in this very building. Now, we've got no proof of it, just like with everything with Mary Jane Kelly, but it's not a silly story because as a Catholic homeless prostitute, she would have been just the sort of woman that those nuns would have welcomed into there with open arms. Oh, it's got dark. Right then, so the double event part 2. Catherine Eddowes. Now, I'll just give you a brief introduction to Catherine. Very popular lady in that part of her life. She was 46 when she passed away. Even though she was born in the Midlands, up near sort of Birmingham, Wolverhampton way, she spent most of her life as an orphan in South London, Bermondsey. Right? So a bit of a tragic life there. We know she never got married, but she was in a very long relationship, a common law marriage, if you wish, with an army guy called Thomas Conway. They had 6 children together. Sometimes she would call herself Kate Conway and stuff like that. That was the way it was. They sort of separated in 1881. So he said it was because of her drink problem. Her sisters said it was because basically he used to beat her up. But when they separated in 1881, she immediately fell in with a man called John Kelly, and together for the last 7 years of her life they lived as literally as man and wife almost at number 55 Flower and Dean Street. Right? And it's interesting, it's quite common nowadays, a lot of researchers are trying to disprove the notion that any of these women were prostitutes. It's a very difficult thing to prove. Catherine Eddowes was the first one back in the day where people thought maybe she wasn't, you know, because John Kelly said in all the years that we were together, and we got thrown around a fair bit, he said, she never did anything to make me suspect that she earned a living off the streets. Like that. But she was found dead about 45 minutes after Liz Stride in Mitre Square. Now, we're going to go to Mitre Square in a minute, that's where we're going to end the tour. But what you should know about Mitre Square is that it is not in the East End of London. Do you remember I talked of the city, right? It's over the boundary. So not only is it within the boundary of the City of London, it means it's therefore under the jurisdiction of the City of London Police, rather than the Metropolitan Police. Right? This is the 21st century version of Mitre Square. Right? Probably the most well-known of the murder sites by name at least, and because we're in the city, it's changed more frequently than any of the other sites. Right? Now, back in those days, this is Mitre Square, taken in 1926, roughly from where I'm standing, looking that way. Right? So you can see how dark and gloomy it is. There was very limited access to it, mostly tall warehouses around all sides, 2 narrow alleyways, one over there, right? And the house that you see in the background here, those people sitting over there, you know, with their drinky poos, they're pretty much sitting in those houses, okay? That was the darkest corner of Mitre Square, just in front of that house, right? And it's not been a corner for generations, but it's still known by a lot of people today as Ripper's Corner. That's what they call it. And it's where we would be standing if it wasn't for that lot. Oh no. But that's unfortunately what happens at the weekend, the weekday. So yeah, that would have been that's where the body of Catherine Eddowes was found, right over there. And we've already sort of talked a bit about the murder, but how about this for getting away with it? 4 people in that house. The bedrooms looked over the murder site. There was a house between the warehouses just over there. A family of 4, off-duty police officer, by the way, in there. They didn't hear anything either. At the other end of the narrow alleyway out there was 2 men standing around sharing a cigarette and a conversation. There was a warehouse night watchman in the warehouse just here. The door of that warehouse was open, right, as he made a cup of tea. And none of those people saw or heard anything. Any one of them could have opened a window, looked out of a door and caught the Ripper in the act. What's most amazingly though, we believe that the murder took place between 1:35 and 1:45 AM. Right bang in the middle of that time slot, a policeman walked down this alleyway, which in those days was only about this wide, stopped at the entrance, which I think roughly would have been where you are, sir, there, and satisfied himself that there was nothing to report, turned round and went back the way he came. And at that time, the Ripper was probably in that corner, holding his breath. You can see why people are worried, can't you? This guy almost seemed to have a supernatural ability to get away with it. And that is why, after the night of the double event, people were very much worried about what was going to happen in October, right? As we said earlier on, I think it was you, wasn't it, talking about the letters coming in after that name Jack the Ripper had been published. Well, some of these letters were promising murders in other parts of the country, 6 more and I'll give myself up, I'm going to do 3 murders in one night, you know, that kind of thing. People were very worried about what October was going to bring. Let's just say they weren't very optimistic. What was odd is that nothing happened in October, even though the expectation was there. Towards the end of the month, newspapers, who obviously had done so much to brew up panic and all the rest of it and create a mythology, started to sort of make suggestions that maybe it was all over. You know, maybe the Ripper had died, he'd gone somewhere else, and effectively were encouraging the people of the East End to get back to normal. Hey, hey, the witch is dead, if you wish, you know. And they did. In that first week of November, women were going back out on the streets again. Shops started opening later because there was custom finally, you know. And then just as they got used to it, on the 9th of November, Thomas Bowyer finds the horrifically mutilated body of Mary Kelly in that little room, and all hell breaks loose again, all right? And that is without anyone seeing that photograph, right? Would you be interested to know when the general public first saw that photograph? 1972. So that late in the day, yeah. On a final note there, just to give an example of how these murders got under the skin of the public, Mary Kelly's funeral, 10 days after her death, was attended by 5 people. The crowds in the street that lined where the funeral procession went was thousands of people lining the streets. It's what you call an outpouring of grief. And they said in the press that there were women openly crying into handkerchiefs, sobbing, talking about that poor woman, men lifting their hats off as respect out of her, which is odd, because that's all over someone who 2 weeks earlier they probably would have crossed the street to avoid. You know, it's very, very strange. Anyway, some people believe the murders carried on after Mary Jane Kelly up until 1891, all right? But what we do know is the murders did end, okay? And it left the world scratching its head, wondering, who the hell? You know, why? All these questions.
Happy birthday, sweetie.
Sweetie.